Well, welcome back. In the previous episode, I left off describing my first meeting with the Pele Hau'ofa on the way to PNG to start my Bush Mekeo fieldwork. Although he was not a self-conscious structuralist, he interpreted Mekeo's social organization, chieftainship, and cosmology as built on a theme, basically a structuralist theme of pervasive dualities. The opposition between equality and inequality was by far the most significant for him, given his focus on chieftainship. Chiefs and hereditary sorcerers or priests, for which Mekeo are famous, are ranked as unequal senior and junior to each other. On Bush Mekeo II, among Bush Mekeo II, I found that the chiefly system was indeed dualistic. But on closer inspection, it was a bit more complicated. Simply put, those dualities, senior and junior, were doubled. Hence, there were four kinds of chiefs and sorcerers. Now, chiefs of peace, chiefs of war, sorcerers of peace, sorcerers of war. And with the chiefs, it was chief of peace who was senior, but with the sorcerers, it was the other way around. The sorcerer of war was senior. So seniority seemed to be operating in an inconsistent way, which was absent in Hau'ofa's account. As I got to look at other dualities of the culture, I found that the same rather twisted, fourfold patterning was systematically reproduced all over. Now, although Pele and I met several times at academic conferences over the years, we never talked about any of that stuff, really, none of that technical stuff. Still, our occasional encounters were always very warm. I think, he enjoyed reminiscing about Mekeo field experiences, which is something the other of us could do with many other people. The last time we met, he confided that based on his first impressions, he and Barbara were pretty sure I didn't have a chance of succeeding with my fieldwork among Bush Mekeo. So we had a good laugh. I don't think most Oceanist colleagues who deservedly admire Pele's later achievements appreciate the extent to which his early work among Mekeo, inspired his later career. By the way, Pele was the first person to tell me that villagers preferred the name North Mekeo, Bush Mekeo preferred the name North Mekeo. So I'll be using that title from now on. Now, upon landing in Moresby in May 1974, I flew up to the Highlands to meet my Minnesota graduate student friends, Paul and Ruth Walt, and stayed with them for 2 weeks. They'd been there for about a year doing field work among Inga people living at very, very high altitudes. And they tutored me, I think, expertly on how to run a field station with a family in tow. And back in Moresby, I paid my respects to Andrew and Marilyn Strathern at the university. And then with the help of long-term resident historian Nigel Oram, I found my way along the newly opened, unpaved Hiratano Highway to the Sacred Heart Mission Station at Hau'ofa. That's right outside Pele's village site. Now, the mission ran a professional hospital staffed by dedicated nurses and 3 priests who Pele had recommended, who my wife and I eventually befriended. Now, the Hau'ofa fathers had a special, as I say, love for Maipa village, one of the 10 or so, due to the friendliness and healthiness, friendliness of the people, the healthiness of the village, and so on. They usually sent newly arriving priests there to spend the first 3 or 4 months, get acclimating to the culture and learning the language. So they all had a really fun attraction to that particular village. And he mentioned that among those 200 people, there existed 5 polygynous marriages, which was just the same number existing in the whole rest of 20,000 Mekeo. So that was an interesting thing about them. And good for me, Maipa was much smaller than Waima and Roro villages, or other Mekeo villages mostly. It had the same fourfold pattern of chiefly leadership, more in bold relief. Lacking road access, though, it had been spared a lot of the harshest influences of, I guess, European contact, and they only had to contend with a single Christian sect, Catholicism, which is much more uh, tolerant than a lot of the Protestants. They lived in elevated rainforests, so had fewer mosquitoes from compared to all the other North Mekeo villages who lived in the swamp. A lot of food, a lot of game. The river was cool, crystal clear. And a couple of days after arriving at Befa, a newly ordained Rora priest was actually embarking on his inaugural tour of North Mekeo by motorized canoe. He invited me along. At the first village we came to, uh, it had carried passengers. A canoe arrived with passengers from upstream, from Maipa. No, they indicated there was a death in the village and people were now organizing a mortuary feast, which I knew something about. So I took that canoe back up the village, arrived at the school, and was escorted and met, I guess, first of all, the chief, one of the chiefs of the clans at Maipa, who the next morning escorted me up to the village. And he agreed to help. So the village consists of two compounds on opposite banks of a swiftly flowing 50-meter wide tributary of the Biara River. The path through the forest led us to the smaller settlement. There, the entire village population was assembled for the death feast. Some 40 or so men were gathered on the elevated chief's platform. Women were busy cooking and attending to chores in a dozen or so of the domestic dwellings. Peter introduced me to his chiefly counterpart of the other clan, Pavivi, and he explained my purpose in coming. I recounted my background in anthropology and my career plan to become a teacher. And for that, I explained I was required to spend a year or so studying the customs of the people. Afterwards, I would write a book on what I'd learned. My wife and soon to be born son would be coming along too. Well, that suited everybody pretty well. Nobody said so, but I'm pretty sure some of the people there already knew about Hau'ofa's work at Befa because they had relationships with that village. Anyhow, after a few minutes of discussion, Pavivi announced that the village would be happy to have us. He added that they already understood what I had in mind, since they had already hosted an Australian female anthropologist there not too long ago. Well, I was astonished after what happened with Roro, but nonetheless, I accepted the invitation to stay. And it was in later months that I learned about my predecessor. She was actually a high school student who had spent maybe 3 weeks in the village during the previous, December to January school break on a one-way exchange program. Now, when someone in the village dies, the whole community dies, they say. Ordinary life is suspended. And on those occasions, the married adults divide into two groups. The owners are the patrilineal clanmates of the deceased. Laborers are their wives and husbands. They belong to another clan. Being closely related to the deceased, the owners are prohibited from the activities of normal life, mainly working, gardening, fishing, cooking, hunting, house building, things like that. Because they're connected to the deceased by patrilineal blood, the laborers are the people obliged to do the work required for staging the funeral feasts that bring the mourners out of mourning and back to ordinary life. Because it was Pavivi, the chief of the owner clan, that accepted me, I was adopted into his clan, Maipa Afai. Thus, I became immediately an owner of that feast. Now, among North Mekeo clans, people marry exogamously. You can't marry anybody of your own clan. So when Cassandra was to arrive, she would join the other clan, Angapu, led by Peter, the chief who had escorted me up to Maipa. Over the next week or so, I, as an owner, sat all day and evening in the clubhouse with the other male owners. The laborer men were dispatched to hunt for pigs and cassowaries, to fish, to build additional platforms and so on, and sometimes I went along with them just to observe. At night, I slept in an abandoned tin trade store. The feast concluded when Pavlovy butchered and distributed the ceremonial portions of pig flesh required to end the grieving. With that, I returned to Moresby to arrange for Cassandra to fly over before giving birth and to secure the supplies that were needed to build us a small bush dwelling. She arrived 8 months pregnant. We secured her a room in a guest house up at the National Hospital to await the birth. Since she was not then due, really, I returned to MIPA to hand over the building materials so work on the house could begin. It took several days to get back to Moresby, though, and I learned on arrival that she had given birth to our son in my absence. Well, when he was just 10 days old, we picked him up and set off for MIPA. It took, I think, as I recall, 4 days of difficult travel to reach the village. We were carrying a little baby in a cardboard box, only slightly larger than a shoebox, like a wine box or something. Anyhow, we brought along 2 canoe loads of supplies intended to last several months. Both canoes overturned on the journey. We were able to salvage most of the goods. The biggest crisis was the fact that the toilet paper carton, hundreds of toilet papers, were drenched, and it took weeks to dry it all out. Anyhow, so we left all the supplies at the school downstream from MIPA and walked them unaccompanied through the forest to the village. So you can imagine how we look forward to a warm welcome after suffering all that and getting there. Well, when we got there, everyone was over at the settlement on the other side of the river, because during my absence, there'd been a death of one of my clansmen living on the opposite side. Well, the river was shallow enough at that moment for us to wade across. On reaching the top of the riverbank, the boss man, who assigns the laborers to do their jobs during feasts, came up to Cass, shouting in a loud voice. Someone translated for her that she had to go down to the river's edge and clean a heap of smoked wallaby meat that was sitting there. Now, that's how bossmen are expected to order laborers around during feasts. Well, Cass, obeying as she was like she had to, handed the baby to me and went off to do as she was been told. Though, of course, by then she was in tears and deeply confused. One of my clan brothers saw this happening. He went down to her and walked her back across the river to the empty trade store where we were to be lodged. Later, when I joined her, I tried to console her with what little I knew about feasts, that the boss man's harsh treatment of laborers is in large part a sham. And it helped when I learned that the boss man's treatment of her was actually entirely out of order. Newly delivered mothers are forbidden for handling food. It's dirty. Her hands are dirty, and so on. Anyhow, more of that later. Afterwards, my clan brothers' wives, who were to become her sisters, and other women, looked after her properly and became her friends. Well, you must appreciate that the 26 months of our first stint of North Mekeo fieldwork amounted to undergoing simultaneously 3 of life's most challenging rites of passage: first marriage, first parenthood, and first fieldwork. I still marvel at how she managed it at all, with so little previous experience and virtually no training. Her inherently generous spirit, no doubt, enabled her to endure the hardships that confronted us. And she was to develop a genuine interest in the people and the culture, which continues to this day, in fact. Now, for those Euro-American listeners who might be contemplating fieldwork in village Melanesia with young families in tow, it might be worthwhile to say a few words regarding the profound differences we, as a married couple, encountered at MIPA compared to America. North Mekeo's social life is built around a so-called separation of the sexes, and it begins kind of in late childhood. Only with maturity, and especially marriage, do women and men become effective agents in their own right. The conventional activities of adult men and women accordingly differ from each other, but they're complementarily structured in ways that were largely foreign to us. To fit as best we could into the community, we followed the example and advice of the people around us, of course. Every morning and evening, I was expected to join my clan brothers and fathers on the chief clubhouse to share meals cooked by our wives. Cass had to cook up a huge pot of tea for the group, loaded with sugar at each of those meals. The women, our wives, would eat together more informally on the veranda of one or another of their homes with all the kids. Cass provided tea there also. Now, this was advantageous for my work as there on the clubhouse. I regularly had a captive audience of knowledgeable people to help me with learning about their culture and their way of life. And it was mainly there I learned about the language. That meant, however, that during most mornings and evenings, early evenings anyhow, the three of us were rarely together. We spent a good share of our late evenings rehearsing stories and gossip we picked up during the day. So during the day, I sought out knowledgeable people to interview at their homes or at ours. So CASCA was left mostly to care for our infant son and run the household. We were often visited casually by friends and informants, pleased to receive a bit of tobacco or a cup of tea. Sometimes Cass actually tried to bake a loaf of bread. Anyhow, there is at Maiva and across Melanesia, I understand, though, a very important rule. I have to emphasize this. Husbands and wives must never engage publicly any activity that suggests physical intimacy or sentiment. No holding of hands, no kissing, no embracing, none of that. Delicing each other's hair, however, is allowed, something we fortunately never had to do. Well, those customary restrictions on married life are greatly accentuated whenever a community member dies. And those restrictions last until the funeral feast is performed, which frees the owners in the mourning. And that could take a few weeks, months, or even a year, depending on the ties people had to the deceased. So given the North Mekeo pattern of exogamous intermarriage, Cass and I spent a considerable portion of our early marriage under the clouds of death. So our separations were even greater during those periods. Me as owner, she as laborer, or the reverse. I reckon about 8 or 10 people died while we were there during those first 2 years, and each of them had extended feasts. Well, my pre-fieldwork preparations for Roro and Hau'ofa's advice were very helpful in orienting us to village life, but there was a big gap describing between what people were doing and what they were supposed to do the way they did it. That, I think, is the greatest challenge confronting every ethnographer. What are they doing, but why do they do it that way? I quickly learned that asking that question, why do you do this or that, didn't get you very far. Typically, I would be told versions of, well, because our ancestor did so, or that's our custom. So that is where my theoretical training came in. Sometimes it was nothing much more sophisticated than following Malinowski's functionalist dictum, to understand the parts of a culture in terms of their relations to each other, rather than by comparing them with elements of our own culture. Well, first, when I was typing up my fuller notes from jottings and school exercise books, I would write a detailed account, or type a detailed account of what I'd learned. Then second, I would type additional comments that came to mind of how that information jibed with data I previously gathered and typed up. So soon after starting my inquiries following that method, I found I was gradually building up a growing total model of the culture, thinking how each new bit of information made sense in relationship to the other bits that I already have. Oftentimes, something else would pop up, something new, and it didn't fit in what I already accumulated. So we had to go back and start over at stage one. That happened over and over. Anyhow, I learned later that this correlated with another of Malinowski's crucial dictums. The biggest mistake an ethnographer can make in the field is to gather data, putting off the task of making sense of it till getting back home. No, I did not undertake my fieldwork unaided. Cass was surprisingly helpful in adding to my questioning analyses. But I was blessed also with the good fortune of making friends with a fantastically well-informed villager, Kaila Muniapu. he became my key informant and friend. Basically, he kept me on track with what I was learning and how I should be thinking about it from a North Mekeo perspective. Now, at Maipa, as in any other village community that I've ever become familiar with, everyone is busy with their own projects. And not everyone is going to be deeply interested in the kind of work that ethnographers do. Well, Kaiva stood out. His deceased father was reputed to be the last truly authoritative repository of North Mekeo traditions. Much of what the elders I got to know when I was there, they had acquired through dealings with Kaiva's father. And it was only into his youngest son, Kaiva, that the old man poured the bulk of his knowledge. So when young Kaiva wanted to play with the other kids in the village street, say, his father kept him close by and schooled him in all he knew. Well, it was about a month or two after we arrived at the village that we started to forge our relationship. I was walking through the rainforest, single file with a group of men. We were out there gathering materials for our house. Suddenly, the man behind me started inquiring about my work using fluent English. Now, he had been a laborer for the two recent death feasts, but we'd never really spoken up till then. He was about my age and he had a young family. Apparently, he had kept his distance from us, till then, anyhow, sizing us up really. It turned out that he was also the younger brother of my adopted mother, Pavlovi's wife, Mange Mange. So he was also of the same clan as Cass. I did not immediately appreciate that his friendship with us was partly based on his felt obligations towards me as a sister's son and Cass as clan daughter. Soon enough, we developed a pattern of late afternoon discussions once he came home from gardening, hunting, or whatever. We spent most of that time going over data I was gathering elsewhere and going over my interpretations of it. He would often correct me or add information I was missing on whatever topic. He also helped with language learning. And soon enough, Kaiva caught on with what I was doing as an anthropologist, learning about the kinds of questions and the kinds of answers I was looking for. As new data came in, we regularly went back to earlier discussions, building and modifying our interpretations as we went on. So that recursive method, I guess you'd call it, was critical. By the end of the doctoral fieldwork, I had pretty good ideas about what I would be tackling in the thesis when I got home. The last night we were together, we stayed up all night going over the high spots of what we had covered. He had once told me that he wouldn't let me go away until he felt confident with the state of knowledge and understanding of their traditions that I had. So that night I asked him if he thought we accomplished that, and he said, yes, Maka. Maka is my village name, anyhow. I should mention, though, that the first year of my fieldwork would have proven grossly inadequate for meeting that goal. I've never understood how the standard 1 year of first fieldwork can be adequate for mastering another culture. Minnesota was that way most of the time. ANU is that way now. I learned the greater bulk of every really important information that I needed for writing up during those last 6 months. Fortunately, Minnesota agreed to my request for fellowship support to cover expenses for a second year of fieldwork. Well, in the next episode, I'll be going into more detail regarding what my North Mekeo research findings added up to. Thanks very much.